أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. يقول الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أن أقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فقلت استغفروا ربكم إنه كان غفارا يرسل السماء عليكم مدرارا ويمددكم بأموال وبنين ويجعل لكم جنات ويجعل لكم أنهارا ما لكم لا ترجون لله وقارا. أما بعد. Brothers and sisters, today a topic that is often discussed and reflected upon, given the state of the world and the technological advancements made around the last century or so, is what are the products and the inventions that are most influential and have had the most effect on societies and peoples, and who are like the best corporations and entities that have pushed those products and gotten people to integrate them into their lives in such a way that they cannot possibly imagine their lives without that thing. And so when you think about that, some of the things that come to mind might be, for example, the smartphone, right? Can people even remember what it was like to live before the smartphone? For your communication, your entertainment, your productivity, your scheduling, all these things to be streamlined in one device. So the smartphone is one of those inventions and products that comes to mind. And perhaps you might think Apple or Steve Jobs, for pushing the iPhone, maybe they're, for lack of a better word, the greatest like salesperson of all time. And some other people might suggest that maybe it's the innovation of computers and personal computers. And maybe they might credit that to Microsoft and Bill Gates, right? Every single home, that was the mission statement of Microsoft, to have a PC in every single home. And that's certainly true today. Every home has a personal computer in it. So perhaps Steve Jobs, perhaps Bill Gates, Microsoft, perhaps they're the greatest salespeople of all time. Other people might say perhaps it was the inventor of the automobile, because automobiles are ubiquitous. There's not a single country on the face of the planet that people can live their lives without using an automobile. So perhaps it was the inventors of the automobiles who are kind of like the greatest salespeople of all time. Other people might say the internet. We live in the age of information and everything is available on the internet. Whether you're a PhD student, whether you're a student in elementary school, whether you work as an engineer, whether you work as a doctor, every single person relies so heavily on the internet. So perhaps the inventors of the internet are the greatest salespeople of all time. But there's something that all these different advancements have in common, and that is that they provide some type of utility. They're useful. So when it comes to being a salesperson, it's really not that hard to sell something that's amazing, right? So if I give you an iPhone and I say this phone can hold many, many terabytes of data, and it can connect to the internet in milliseconds, and it can stream videos in a higher quality than DVD or VCR or anything like that. And it can do this and it can do that, it can schedule your day, it can connect to email, it can do all these things. You can FaceTime and see your relatives from all the way on the other side of the world. That's not a hard product to sell because it has an amazing amount of utility. So the same thing can be said of all these other advancements and achievements, automobiles, the internet, iPhones, computers, whatever you want to say. They all have a utility. So a better salesman is the one who's able to sell a product that doesn't provide utility, who's able to sell you something that really doesn't give you anything useful. right? But he still makes you want to have it. He still makes you want to take it. That's a better salesman than the one who's selling a product that has some value. And there are plenty of examples of that even in the world today. Look at the marketing for alcohol. We might make an argument that there's some minor benefit that's derived from alcohol in terms of maybe relaxing a person and stuff like that. But wallahi, the damage and destruction that alcohol causes to societies and families and people is such a catastrophic level. And you can see how many accidents are caused by drunk driving. How many people fall into addiction because of alcohol abuse. How many people commit domestic abuse because of alcohol abuse. How many families are torn apart. How many children don't have parents because of alcohol. But somehow, every year, alcohol continues to sell and make billions and billions of dollars for those who are selling it. How is that possible? That shows the skill of marketing. And so you can say very honestly that the people selling alcohol are doing a better job at being salespeople than those selling products that have utility. Because alcohol provides pretty much no benefit and infinite destruction, but people keep coming and buying it. And you can also point at the example of cigarettes. Cigarettes maybe provide a minor pleasure to a person, small buzz, but wallahi, it causes so many people to be lifelong addicts. It makes a person's breath and body stink. It turns a person's nails and teeth yellow. If I tell you any other product and I tell you you want something that does this to you, you'll say no way. Oh, never touch that. But the companies that propagate cigarettes and advertise cigarettes have done such an amazing job at making that product seem amazing. Even though it causes all that damage, people are still willing to buy cigarettes. And so you can fairly say that the salespeople who are selling alcohol and cigarettes are much more skilled salespeople than those peddling other products that are useful. But really, brothers and sisters, from the perspective of Islam, the greatest salesperson of all time, without a doubt, and there's absolutely no doubt about this, is the shaitan. The devil, Iblis, Lucifer, whatever you want to call him, the shaitan is the greatest salesperson of all time. Because he sells humanity, he sells the children of Adam on the idea that leaving the one thing that is the best for them in every aspect of their life is what they should do. That one thing that brings them happiness and contentment and money and wealth and satisfaction and a true peace of the heart, leaving that is what they should do. He sells them on that idea. And that thing is living a life in accordance to the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Living a religious life. A life in which your primary focus is building a relationship with Allah Azza wa Jal. But shaitan this life that a person lives for the purpose of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings innumerable benefit to a person. Blessings in his wealth, in his health, for his children, protection for his children, for his family, preservation of his legacy. All these things come with living a righteous life. But the shaitan convinces the human being to not do this, to not live a life in accordance with the rules and obligations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to be heedless. And so the job, and another interesting point, brothers and sisters, is we know that for a long time, Islam was the primary power in the world. And people took their religion seriously. But when we look at the ummah today, so many of us really don't have that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So many of us don't pray. So many of us don't have a relationship with the Quran. So how did this situation come about to be today? And it's very interesting to look at, if you look at history, what colonial European powers did in the lands of Islam where they took power. And there was a large portion of the ummah that was colonized. And one of the things that colonizers did in the lands of Islam was they specifically targeted the scholars of that land. For example, the British made it an intentional strategy to target the scholars. Why? Because the prestige that people had for ilm and the prestige that they used to give to the scholars directly related to the importance that they had for Islam in their lives. And so the government used to provide stipends for scholars. It used to be a thing where if you went to become a scholar, it was kind of like how we view becoming a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer today. It was a position that was seen with esteem and pride, right? People wanted their children to become scholars, and that is absolutely not the case today. And so what the British did is they removed that government support for scholarship and they made it independent. And so they made Islam in the eyes of the people something low and something not valuable. And even if you look at, for example, the subcontinent today, what do people do if their child can't cut it enough to become a doctor? Or he can't cut it enough to become a lawyer? Or he can't cut it enough to become an engineer? Right? They send him off to madrasa and make him a husband. That's the view that of post-colonial societies in the Islamic world towards Islam and religion. It's not something they see as valuable. It's not something they see that needs to be prioritized. It's something that has become low in their eyes, something lowly in their eyes, something not very valuable. So the job of the believers, brothers and sisters, is to not be deceived by shaitan. Allah Azza wa Jalla said, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, la tattabi'u khutuwati shaitan. Don't follow in the footsteps of shaitan. So the job of the believer is to be aware of the strategies of the shaitan and outmaneuver him. So we know that shaitan wants us to not live a religious life, a life in accordance with the rules and obligations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So our job then is to do exactly the opposite, right? To get away from that idea that shaitan has planted in us, that it's not important to have a relationship with Allah, that it's not important to pray. And it's upon us to figure out why it's important to do those things and live a life in accordance with the way Allah has asked us to walk a path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to make a journey towards Allah Azza wa Jal. And as with anything, brothers and sisters, if somebody's asking you to do something, the first thing that comes to the mind of every single person, if somebody tells you buy this product, go to this school, pursue this career, you want to know one thing first, and that's what's in it for me. What is the benefit that a person derives from living a religious life, from praying his 5 salawat, from remembering Allah Azza wa Jal, from reflecting upon the Quran, from learning the seerah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? What's in it for you and I to do that? Why should we do it? Why does it matter? And people might say it's beneficial for the afterlife, but I'm living life here. So why do I care? Like why should I care about the afterlife? What does it do for me now here when I'm living my day-to-day life in this world? And unfortunately, the perception that has come to a lot of us and that a lot of us now believe is that living a religious life is only beneficial for the next world, and this is the deception of shaitan. Because wallahi, brothers and sisters, the most beneficial thing a person can do for his life, even on this world, is to obey Allah Azza wa Jal. And to that end, I wanted to share some stories so that we can perhaps take some reflection from these and understand what kind of benefit and what kind of amazing blessings come into a person's life from being religious, from obeying the commands Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him, and from making an effort to know his creator. And so I have 2 examples today. The first of them is a story that takes place around 150 years after the Hijrah. So there was a gardener who worked in a pomegranate orchard. And a gardener, as all of you know, is like menial labor. He's not somebody who's famous or respected. Nobody wants their child to grow up to become a gardener. So he's just a normal guy working kind of like a below average job. And so he's working in this pomegranate orchard. And one day, the guy who owns the orchard, his boss, comes to him and he says, hey, go get me a ripe pomegranate. One that's tasty, that's not rotten. Go bring me a ripe pomegranate. He says, okay. So he goes and comes back with a pomegranate. The guy tastes it, his boss, his owner, the master of the orchard tastes it, and he's like, this is rotten, this is not ripe. Go bring back another one. So he says, okay, fine. So he goes back and finds another pomegranate and he brings it back. The guy takes another bite, he says, this is also rotten. Go bring me another one. So he comes back the 3rd time with another pomegranate and gives it to him again. And the guy takes another bite, he's like, this one's also rotten. And now he's kind of irritated. He's like, what kind of a gardener are you who's worked in a pomegranate orchard for so many years? You don't even know the difference between a good pomegranate and a bad one. What's wrong with you? And so the gardener tells him, I've never tasted a pomegranate. I don't know what a good pomegranate, like how to tell when one's ripe, when one's ready to eat. I don't know. And the owners can't understand. How can you have never tasted a pomegranate? You work in a pomegranate orchard. You're literally walking by that fruit every day. How have you never tasted it? And he says, you're the owner of the orchard. You own all those fruits. You never gave me permission to eat one of those fruits. And the owner is so shocked at that level of honesty, at that level of religiosity, at that level of taqwa. He is so shocked that this guy has been working in this orchard for so many years, and he hasn't even tasted one bite of a pomegranate to know the difference between a ripe and a rotten one. And he's so impressed by this that he gets the gardener, the menial, low-wage earning gardener, he asks him to marry his daughter, and he marries him to his daughter. And they get married and they have a son. And their son was Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. And for anybody familiar with any type of Islamic history or scholarship, Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak is one of the most famous scholars in the history of Islam. And he was well known and respected because not only was he so religious, and not only was he staying up at night and worshipping, and not only did he make such a substantial contribution to Islamic scholarship, he was also massively, massively wealthy. He was so massively wealthy that he could afford to go to Hajj every year. He was so massively wealthy that there's a story that one time he went for Hajj, and you know that Hajj is a significant investment. Even if you have money, back in those days, to go for like a journey of years and months, it's not cheap. He went for that journey and he saw someone who was poor, who wasn't able to go for Hajj, and he had so much money that he didn't mind giving the money that he was going to use for himself to the other person for them to make Hajj. He was massively wealthy. And brothers and sisters, this story has a couple of benefits for us to take. Firstly, the benefit from the gardener who was honest and virtuous, and he lived in accordance with Allah Azza wa Jall's rules. He didn't have anything, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him everything. He was poor, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him rich. He didn't have any infrastructure, anything like that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him massively wealthy. And the second benefit, brothers and sisters, for those who are parents, or those who are new parents, or those who are looking to get married in the future and have children, is that the value and the righteousness of a parent has a direct impact on their children. When Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions in Surah Kahf the story of the orphans and the orphans who left and their father had left behind a treasure for them in the wall. Allah sent Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khidr to protect that treasure. Why did he do that? وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا, because their father was righteous. And this is a very powerful lesson to all of us, that parents who live a righteous and good life have a direct impact on their children, and their children will receive an amazing amount of blessings and barakah in their own life because of what their parents did. The third benefit, brothers and sisters, from this story is the legacy and the love in the hearts of the people that a person gets by being religious. And Abdullah ibn Mubarak's father was a gardener, and he was not a scholar, he was not a ruler, he was not anything like that. But wallahi, how many scholars and rulers have come and gone and died and been forgotten, and people still talk about, with respect and admiration, the father of Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, the gardener. Look at how Allah Azza wa Jal preserved the legacy of a simple gardener and put such love for him in the hearts of people, just because he had taqwa of Allah and he lived a life in accordance with Allah's rule. The second story that I want to mention, brothers and sisters, is also from around the same time period. In fact, this person in this story was a direct contemporary of Abdullah ibn Mubarak. And he also ended up becoming a scholar, and he and Abdullah ibn Mubarak were somewhat considered like the two greatest people of that era. And people, just like we have debates and discussions today about who's the best basketball player, or which company is the best, or who's the best soccer player, or who's the best football player, people used to have discussions about who is the best person of this era, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, or the subject of the second story, Al-Fudail ibn Iyad. Fudail ibn Iyad, brothers and sisters, lived around the same time period, around 150 years or so after Hijrah, and he was a bandit. He was a highwayman and a robber. So when people, he would, like wait in camp and see travelers who are coming not protected, he would jump out, attack them, and steal their belongings. He was a thief, and he lived that kind of life for many years. And there was one day when he was climbing over a wall. He was climbing over a wall, and he heard somebody reciting Quran. And he heard them reciting the verse, أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُم لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Isn't it time for those who believe to have their hearts softened at the remembrance of Allah? And keep in mind who he is and what he's done. He's a criminal. He spent his entire life doing wrong. And he might have had some small good mixed in, but for the most part he's been a bad person. And he hears this one ayah and he decides right then and there, I'm going to make an intention to change my life. I'm going to make a journey towards Allah. And he leaves right then at that moment to Makkah, and he spent the rest of his life working to learn Islam and study Islam, and he became one of the greatest scholars of the era, to the point that people used to argue who's better, him or Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. And this is perhaps the most significant lesson from these two stories. Both of these people are very different people. Ibn Mubarak was never a criminal. He was never someone who had left the salah. He was never any of these things. He was brought up in a household of righteousness, and he continued to live a righteous life. And that's an admirable thing, and that's great. But not everybody has that luxury. Not everybody has the luxury of having parents who teach them Islam and teach them the importance of having a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some people grow up in families and households where that's not important. And that's where those of us who have somewhat lost our way, those of us who maybe we pray once a week, who maybe we pray twice a day, can find a lot of encouragement not to lose heart, that we can still change the story. Because Fudail ibn Iyad was one of the worst people in society. And Allah Azza wa Jal made him one of the best, to the point that people literally used to have debates and discussions who was the best person of this era, Ibn al-Mubarak or Fudail ibn Iyad. So any person who has somewhat slipped in his duty towards Allah should never think that he's too far gone, should never think that there's nothing that he can do to come back to a place of goodness in the eyes of Allah Azza wa Jal. And the history of Islam, brothers and sisters, is filled with so many examples of people like this. Who was Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu before he changed his life? He was a drunk, and he used to harass the Muslims, and he was an enemy to Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him the second greatest companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevated him to such a status that he was the ruler of the empire of Islam at the height and the peak and the pinnacle that that empire ever reached. And finally, brothers and sisters, another beautiful example of that kind of person is the Mahdi. The same Mahdi who will come at the end of times. The same Mahdi who will lead armies into battle against the Dajjal. The same Mahdi for whom, when Isa ibn Maryam comes back to this world and he descends, he will allow the Mahdi to lead him in salah. The Prophet ﷺ said about that same Mahdi that Allah will change his heart in a night. Meaning that he was a person who was not very religious before, and he was not very righteous before, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will change him in an instant. And this, brothers and sisters, should give encouragement and heart to every single one of us who has somewhat fallen off the path. And maybe you don't even want to come back. This should give us, brothers and sisters, encouragement to make that step and to come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Firstly, because of the benefit it brings internally, the peace of the heart. One of the scholars of the Salaf from the earliest generations of Islam, he told one of his students, if the kings and their sons, those with power to take things, those with power to have whatever they want, if they knew what we experienced of pleasure and happiness in our hearts because of Islam, wallahi, they would fight us with swords to get that pleasure and contentment. And brothers and sisters, for those of you, for example, in Ramadan, who have felt that peace and contentment when you were at your highest level, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala properly, avoiding haram, you will know that you feel that contentment. For those who have made umrah, who have been to the holy city of Mecca, who have been to the Prophet's Masjid, they will know that they feel a special peace and contentment that no amount of money can buy when they live that kind of life, working on their relationship with Allah and prioritizing the hereafter. And finally, brothers and sisters, the second benefit that we can take from these stories is that living a righteous life isn't only beneficial for the afterlife and a person's internal state. Wallahi, it's beneficial for a person's money. So many of us want to be rich, and you spend our times watching videos on what are the best stocks to buy to become rich, what's the best major to study to be rich, what are the best investments to make for a person to become rich and wealthy, what are the best 401k investments for a person to make to become rich. Wallahi, brothers and sisters, look at the gardener from the story of Abdullah ibn Mubarak. He was poor and lowly, and because he cared about his relationship with Allah and he had taqwa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him rich. And look at his son Abdullah ibn Mubarak, whose father was a gardener, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him rich. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith that whoever makes the hereafter his focus, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring peace to his heart, and he will order his affairs, and he will drag the world to him. He will drag worldly affairs to him. Right? He won't even try, and he will become rich. He won't even try, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send blessing and barakah in his life. And people spend, it's such a tragedy and it's so ironic that people spend so much time trying to figure out how to become successful and wealthy in this world at the expense of leaving the next life, at the expense of leaving their relationship with Allah, when in reality, both worlds would come to them if they only prioritize their Creator Ar-Rahman. And finally, brothers and sisters, now that we have kind of discussed what is the importance of living a life in accordance with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how do we do that? So, in the story, we can see that there are two different examples. One person, he kind of was already practicing, so to speak. And there are a lot of us here today who, alhamdulillah, perhaps we're in that situation. We grew up in households where Islam was the norm, where salah was prioritized, where fasting was prioritized, where the Quran was prioritized. So we're kind of already practicing. And for us, for those of us who are in that position, who are fortunate enough to be in that position, the path forward to the journey to Allah Azza wa Jal is to continue to learn. To learn Arabic so we can understand the Quran, to memorize some of the Quran, to memorize some of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, to know the history of Islam, to know what Islam brought to the world, the benefits, and to maybe give some da'wah. That's the path forward for us, to continue to advance ourselves towards Allah Azza wa Jal. And for those of us who are perhaps a little waylaid from that path, who have perhaps lost that connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who perhaps don't pray or don't see the importance of doing it, brothers and sisters, the path, the journey forward to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for you is so simple. It is just to make a small intention and take a step. The Prophet ﷺ said, Allah Azza wa Jal said, in a hadith he reported that Allah said, when my slave comes to me walking, when he takes a small amount of effort, I go to him running. So all that's required of you is to make a small change and a small step, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will magnify that effort and will take you places you could never have imagined. The gardener in the pomegranate orchard could never ever have imagined being rich and wealthy and having a son who's one of the greatest scholars of Islam, but Allah made that possible for him. And so too, brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can make anything possible for you, and He will bring the world crawling to you on its knees. And all you need to do is take that small step towards changing yourself. Perhaps if you pray no salah, make a commitment to pray maybe once a day, 3 times a week. Perhaps if you don't fast in Ramadan, make a commitment to fast 5 or 6 times. Perhaps if you pray 2 times a day, make the commitment to add 1 more. Small incremental steps and change, and that small effort that you put towards Allah will return many fold in a way that no other investment that you've ever done has benefited you. And so, brothers and sisters, I hope inshallah that this has given us an idea of how to move forward and get these kind of blessings and barakah in our lives, both in this life and the next life. May Allah Azza wa Jal make us amongst those who walk the journey to Him for our entire lives. May He make us amongst those who are continually improving ourselves for His sake. And may He bless us with the best. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً, in this world the best. وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً, and in the next world the best. وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ, and may He save us from the hellfire. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Brothers and sisters, before I conclude and we start the salah, I'll mention one more story, inshallah, to really show you the power and value that living a righteous and religious life can have in a person's worldly affairs and how it can benefit him. My family is from the southernmost part of India, and my great-grandfather grew up in a village. Even today, it's very small. It doesn't have a lot of electricity or modern amenities or anything like that. In fact, my dad likes to make fun of my mom because she's from this village. They don't even have a train station. So he says, like, if you want to get there, you got to jump off the train to get there. So it's a very small place. And my great-grandfather grew up in that village. And my grandmother used to tell us that when he was young, he was very, very poor, to the point that the only thing he had was like one set of clothes. And if he wanted to wash those clothes, he'd have to just wait with a towel on until the clothes were ready. So he was very, very poor. And he became enormously wealthy. And sometimes, like when I visited back home, I've seen like the house that he built for himself. It doesn't make any sense at all. That he came from where he came from, and he got at the end of it, towards like the later parts of his life, what he got. And he was massively wealthy. And for a long time, that's the only thing I knew about him. And then I came to find out a little later on, he still had some old books in his library. I found out that he was so interested in Islam. And he had studied translations of the Quran and Shafi'i fiqh and all kinds of things that are, it's really impressive that he studied that 60 and 70 years ago at a time when the internet wasn't there, when it wasn't easy to see those things. But he was extremely religious. And my grandma always tells us that he made it a point to always live his life as he learned from reading these things and reading the Quran. He always prioritized giving to his relatives who were poor. He always prioritized praying the salah, making the fasting, and all these kinds of things. And the blessing and barakah that Allah put in his life is honestly amazing. That he was poor in a small village, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him massively rich. And alhamdulillah, mashallah, he was so wealthy and well off that he had 6 children. And each children inherited from him what was enough that they were pretty much set for life. And so brothers and sisters, all these stories I hope show us that the value that a person can bring into his life by living a life in accordance with Allah. And may Allah Azza wa Jal make us amongst those people. عباد الله اتقوا الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون وأقيموا الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على